Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside the Americas here on France 24. On the show this week, we focus on the conversation George Floyd's death while in police custody has ignited over in the United States. But first, we need to take a look back at the history of racial violence in the country. The abolition of slavery brought about a fundamental shift in the United States, but it failed to leave everyone on an equal footing.
In 1865, slavery was abolished in the United States. African Americans became free, but still faced widespread discrimination in their everyday lives. Racial progress made during the Reconstruction era provoked a backlash, particularly in the South. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation on public transport, in schools and at work, while lynchings targeting Black Americans became widely practiced from the late 1870s. After emerging in the 1860s, white supremacist group the Ku Klux Klan saw its membership grow in the 1920s and 30s. The 1950s marked the beginning of a series of important breakthroughs for civil rights. In 1954, a landmark decision by the Supreme Court desegregated schools. Linda Brown, who was denied admission to an all-white school in her neighborhood, was at the center of the class action. A year later, in 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested and fined for refusing to give her seat to a white passenger on a bus. A boycott against Montgomery Bus Company was led by Martin Luther King, who went on to become a prominent leader of the civil rights movement. Despite carrying out peaceful protests, demonstrators were often met with force.
The historic year in race relations.
In 1964, the Civil Rights Act banned racial discrimination and ended segregation in public places, which had lasted for almost a century. But with discrimination deeply entrenched in American life, the struggle for equality was far from over. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, dealing a heavy blow to the civil rights movement. By the late 60s, Black Power became a prominent movement, promoting self-determination through economic empowerment and the creation of political and social institutions. In the decades that followed, African Americans continued to face police brutality. In 1991, Rodney King was violently beaten by police officers. A year later, the officers were acquitted of police brutality charges, sparking unprecedented riots in Los Angeles.
Now, George Floyd's death has sparked protests across the United States. Once again, a tragic incident shining the spotlight on the criminal justice system and systemic racism inside law enforcement. Activists out on the street, meanwhile, are hoping for reforms and budget cuts to the police. Terry Fitzpatrick and Pierrick Laurent filed this report from LA.
Battle dress and assault rifles on Hollywood Boulevard. The National Guard was called to prevent and contain protest violence. In this march, a large crowd of youths eager to condemn recurring incidents of police brutality toward African Americans.
George Floyd!
What's his name?
George Floyd!
I am protesting as a Black woman in America that we need to end this violence, this senseless violence of nonstop killing innocent Black men.
Accusations confirmed by statistics. Every 2 days in America, an African American dies in police custody. At the edge of the protest, some stop in front of the Los Angeles Police Headquarters, where an officer spent hours discussing the issue and expressing solidarity.
We are sick. We're tired. We're with you. And my office is not saying like, oh, I can't believe they're protesting. We're like, we can't believe they have to protest. Unfortunately, there is racism in law enforcement.
After he's unconscious. How do you
That's the simple answer.
Systemic racism in law enforcement traces back to America's unique past, according to historians.
It's not a far leap to suggest that what we call the modern form of policing has direct reflections under slavery. I mean, police do need to be held accountable. The fear for my life defense and excuse should no longer be tolerated.
The Los Angeles Police Department has often been accused of protecting its officers, even when they violate policies or the law. That's why, since 2015, street patrols are filmed. 9,000 LAPD officers are equipped with body cams.
Hey, gentlemen, could I interrupt you guys for a sec?
Yeah.
Cameras provide information about a suspect's guilt or innocence, and about the officer's conduct.
They're just saying that, the vest, the bulletproof vest can save your life, but the camera, it can save your career potentially.
There's still a long road ahead to instill public confidence. Officers have been accused of turning off their cameras during sensitive arrests. Racial discrimination could become a central topic in the 2020 presidential election campaign.
To talk more about the conversation taking place in the United States, we can speak to Reed Kennedy, chair of the Paris chapter of Democrats Abroad France. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Now, we've seen instances like George Floyd's death happen time and time again in the United States. Why is the response different this time around?
Well, thank you for having me. I agree with you. We have seen this time and time again from the civil rights movement through to George Floyd. I would say one of the big differences now is the diversity of the protesters. So you see white, black, Asian, Latin American, Latino, everyone is out protesting this, and the sustained nature is also different than the past. If you look at the geographic diversity as well, you have protests from New Mexico to New York. You have protests in rural communities, suburban communities, and obviously in cities. I think the difference for me is you've seen what used to be called the silent majority, which was used by Nixon in his campaigns with the Southern strategy. You've seen Trump try to co-opt some of that language in recent times. That silent majority, which did not feel racism was a serious problem or a problem that was a cultural problem. They thought it was specific to black people. That silent majority has become a minority. And so I think that's the big difference now.
Now, the protests this time around have been met with a heavy-handed police response. Is the police force in the United States simply incapable of change?
Well, I think discrimination and racism is a virus. It's very deeply rooted within American culture, in particular policing culture. If you look at the reason police forces were created was initially to control the slave population. So there's a long history from the beginning of the country. They call it the original sin of racism and slavery. I think it will take generations to remove the stain of slavery, but there are systematic things that you can do to address the current situation. If you look at the recently released Justice and Policing Act, which was released by the Democratic Party with Nancy Pelosi taking the lead, focused on systemic change in terms of policy. So banning chokeholds, increasing individual liability by police officers when they act incorrectly, by creating a database of police officers who have been convicted in crimes, by increasing civilian review, and by reinstating the federal oversight that was in place with the Obama administration, which Trump's Justice Department has gotten rid of in recent years. So there are things that you can do on a policy level to improve the situation, to decrease the violence, to stop the murders.
Indeed.
But as I said, the cultural virus that is racism will take generations to get rid of.
Speaking of the discussion that's happening in the United States now, for the first time, notions of white privilege are being questioned. Before George Floyd was murdered, we did see that video to emerge from Central Park of Amy Cooper, who was walking her dog without a leash, and then she got hysterical once a black man told her what to do. I want to ask you what it was like for you growing up as a black man in the United States. Were you ever told what to do if you left the house, how to act if you were ever stopped?
Sure. I grew up in South Carolina, in Greenville, South Carolina, which is one of the most conservative parts of the United States. Of course, you have that talk with your parents. You have to act a different way. You can't take the same types of risk that your white friends take, because the consequences are that much more dire. You only have one chance as a black man in America, whereas with white privilege, you're given several opportunities. You have the flexibility to make mistakes. For black children, that's just not the case. I have been pulled over in front of my own house and questioned by police as to whether or not I could live in this neighborhood. I've been pulled over by police and taken out of the car and handcuffed on a curb for a traffic violation. Sure, it's happened to me personally. I think every black American has a story of when their rights have been violated by the police or in general with other types of racism.
And what about the election? You know, looking ahead, I know that we've had an African American president in the past. I know Barack Obama was no Jesus Christ, and he could not, wave a magic wand and change everything. But can Joe Biden really fix things if he does become the president?
Well, I think Joe Biden can address the problem. He can at least acknowledge the problem. If you look at Trump, for example, he does not believe that systemic racism is a problem within police forces in the United States. If you look at the language Trump uses in describing peaceful protesters as thugs, while white Americans trying to protest the removal of a Confederate statue are good people. Joe Biden can look at the reality of racism and understand that we have a long, difficult process ahead of us, but you have to do something. So you start with policy fixes, as I mentioned before, in terms of policing. You look at how do you reinvest in the Black community? How do you strengthen the Community Reinvestment Act? How do you build Black entrepreneurship? How do you improve the education system? How do you improve the inequitable healthcare system? So there are things that can be done to address this inequality in the short term. And I do think Joe Biden is the one candidate that can do that. He has the experience within the legislative branch, within the executive branch. He has the knowledge of the issues. He is someone who has historically made things happen. If you look at his role within the Obama administration as really the person that went out and laid the ground to pass groundbreaking legislation amongst his former Senate colleagues. So I think Joe Biden is a great candidate. I think he represents America. I think he's looking to rebuild the soul of America, rebuild the moral foundation that Trump has chipped away at in terms of moral leadership around the world on a variety of different issues. So yes, I do think Joe Biden can make improvements.
Reed Kennedy, thank you very much for joining us here on France 24.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's it for this edition, and we end on some of the powerful images to emerge during the commemorations for George Floyd, who was laid to rest in Houston after he was killed when a white police officer knelt on his neck. Thank you very much for watching.
Some of the world's most influential people talk to France 24.
Government cannot do much promotion of human value.
Politicians.
E acho que sem política não há democracia.
Scientists, athletes and artists.
Nous les femmes, si on se serre les coudes, on peut vraiment avoir une action très très positive sur le monde.
The American Film Festival in Deauville.
Get all the insight.
The government is still spying.
And the voices that matter on France 24.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.